As you know, Cameroon just elected its new president on October 7th, 2019. What you may not know is that the said president was the incumbent, who has been president for the last 36 years. Obviously, his victory doesn't sit well with many, including the runner-up, who, like the other opposition leaders, have been blaming the electoral process for enabling incessant fraud, thereby barring all avenues for any regime change through the ballot box. That's where my guest comes in handy. I'm joined by Mark Njo, a Nova Scotia lawyer who has insight on these issues and was born in Cameroon. Together, we shall cast a world view on the electoral process in Cameroon. Thanks for accepting the invitation, Mark.
Thanks for having me.
You've heard the introduction that I just gave, and it begs the first question. Elecam, the electoral code in Cameroon. What can you say about Elecam's conduct of the elections, especially the presidential elections? And overall, what does the electoral code provide for free, fair, and transparent elections?
Yeah, I think the electoral code of Cameroon is pretty robust. There are some minor things that could be fixed, but there's not a huge problem with the code. The problem is with the processes and the people managing the processes that the code contemplates. So when I say this, what I mean by this is the body that you refer to as Elecam is the Electoral Commission that was constituted to manage elections in Cameroon. Now, this body is constituted largely by appointments. The people who manage these processes are appointed by the President of the Republic, are appointed by the President of the Senate, are appointed by the President of the National Assembly. Now, you would see a problem with that, wouldn't you?
You're saying that the head of state is in charge of appointing everybody across the board. So that in itself, is that a problem?
Now, the political parties do have representation on certain commissions that are constituted by Elecam to manage the process. What I'm saying is that the people who sit at the very top of this body called Elecam are all appointees of either the President of the Republic or people who are very close to the President. The code says that the President can appoint 3 people, one of whom is going to be the President of the Elecam. The President of the National Assembly appoints 3 other people. The President of the Senate appoints 3 other people. That's 9, right? And then the body itself is constituted of 11 people. That's the who chair this body. So the other 3 are appointed by other means. But you see that the 9 people that are appointed by people who are deep within the regime. Right? So that in itself...
But that is easy to say, because if Cameroon has only known 2 presidents and the incumbent in this particular context has been in office for 36 years, how can fraud be kind of averted in a context where elections are always disputed?
Simple. You need independent, strong, vibrant institutions. Elecam is an institution managing the electoral process, but the way it is constituted takes away the independence and the impartiality. And therefore, the elections are often always contested because there is a perception that the body that manages the electoral process is not fair, and the elections, therefore, are not free and fair.
Okay, we'll take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll try to talk about the political landscape and why opposition parties are still protesting even after the results of October 7th elections have been proclaimed. Just stay with us, we'll be right back. Welcome back, and thank you for staying tuned. I'm still joined with Mark Njo, who is a Nova Scotia lawyer, and we're talking about the electoral process in Cameroon. And the question is, free, fair, transparent, or not? And we were just transitioning into the second phase, where I have a couple of questions that I want to ask my guest. And I want to just go straight and say, first of all, the fact that there's been only two governments in Cameroon, two regimes, and you say the electoral process is straightforward. My question to you is simple. Why has the opposition not been able to take over power, despite the cases we've seen so far from 1990, when multi-party politics became a reality to date?
Well, that's a very good question. The reason is because prior to 1990, when multipartyism came into play, there was only one party. So the regime, this current regime, was in power then. So they had mastered the monopoly of a one-party system, of the machinery that works the elections, that works the process. And so when multi-party politics came into play, all the opposition parties were still like children, still trying to build their caliber, try to build their processes around understanding how to play with the electoral process. But the regime had already mastered this because, mind you, even though they had a one-party system, they still had elections within that one party, they still had processes, and that is the machinery that they've transported into the new era of multipartyism. And because there was a longevity there where they had experience building that, they have simply used that to expand and dominate and monopolize the electoral process.
But when you say that, it looks like, oh, there is a whole regime that is in place that has everything figured out. But in 1992, the opposition had a shot, and
well,
the results are telling.
The opposition didn't form the government.
Well, but the results show that at least the incumbent had 39. If my memory doesn't fail me, well, somewhere around 39%. I mean, if you look at the result, it shows that at least the electoral process produced results that were really telling of a multi-party
well, there's no question, and that goes back to your question. There's no question that the opposition parties back in 1990, specifically the SDF, everybody says the SDF won that election, right? But Frundi never became president, right? The incumbent stayed president. Well, that goes back to your problem. That goes back to your question. Why hasn't the opposition been able to mobilize to take over power? It's because, as I said, the regime, that's the incumbent government, has had a monopoly of the electoral process. They have the machinery, and also they are in control of the institutions that would allow for the opposition.
The Cameroon people are more intelligent than that. It's not, I mean, when you look at it across the board, you have intellectuals sitting in all offices. You have people
appointed by the president.
What about those who work in the private sector and those who constitute
the private
24
sector
million
in Cameroon is not very active in political life.
But what happens when we see all the activists being arrested, sometimes for a public disorder, but at the same time we see public media, or not even public media, private media, publishing all sorts of images and stories, and you hear a lot about the politics, and sometimes people even joke that all Cameroonians can become presidents in the way they think they can run the country. But not to say it's not a serious issue, but I think the Cameroonian population, the people in Cameroon, are more active than you give them credit for.
No. I'm not taking away from the Cameroonian people. What I'm saying is that the regime has become so robust and has monopolized the electoral process, so much so that despite the activity, despite the responsiveness of the people, it is all swayed aside because the regime has such a control of the process. And another thing, I'll just make this quick point. The opposition hasn't been able to form a strong coalition that can defeat the regime. They've tried. They've tried several times, and they haven't been able to. Now, what does that speak to? Does that speak to their abilities to organize the abilities to come together and collaborate to achieve a common goal? Or is it that the regime continues to play the politics of divide and rule? You know best.
Well, it's easy to blame the regime, but just on the presidential front, though. So the October 1992 presidential elections, the president, the incumbent, had 39.98% of the vote.
Right.
Which is already below the 50% mark.
Right.
We'll take a short break, but when we come back, we'll talk about the numbers and try to put it across the regions and see why we don't agree on what is playing out on the ground and what we have as official information.
Right.
So don't go nowhere, we'll be right back. Welcome back and thanks for staying with us. I'm still with Mark, and just so you know, Mark is a Nova Scotia lawyer who hails from Cameroon and has a lot to tell us about the electoral process in Cameroon and how the process is free, fair, transparent or not. And before we went on the break there, I was just trying to get my head around why the opposition parties have not been able to take power, despite the fact that the electoral code is really robust and the process should be free and fair. And it's no longer news that the October 7th elections, gave victory to the ruling CPDM party's candidate, President Paul Biya, and his percentage was 71.28. And it's funny because 6.6 million Cameroonians were registered. Only about 3.5 million actually voted. And so in a country of 24 million people, there you understand, with 12 million eligible voters, you ask yourself, why the apathy?
Well, political apathy is natural in Cameroon. It has grown over time. When you have a president that has been in power for 36 years, people all of a sudden start saying, you know what, I'm powerless. What can we do that is going to change things, right? And that is one of the reasons for the apathy. The other reason is just that there has been this ongoing crisis, which caused, I think, 2 regions in the country to significantly be absent from the ballot or from the vote. You know, it is alleged that only 5% of the people in the Northwest and Southwest regions voted.
That's a case on its own, because the question is, did any leader go in those regions to campaign?
Well, some people did. I mean, the SDF, you know, those who know Cameroon politics will say, you know, those are usually the strongholds of, you know, parties like the SDF and things like that. So, of course, they made some campaigns there. But, you know, the people were determined not to vote anyways. And so that's, like you said, that's a different thing.
That's a different case. Yeah. That's a case on its own, the Anglophone crisis, because many critics were asking the question, how could we have organized? How could Cameroon come up with an election, or maybe hold through to organize an election when 2 important regions in the country are virtually paralyzed? But I want to speak specifically about the runner-up. 3 days, first of all, for the Constitutional Council to go through petitions. It was broadcast live. A lot of people saw it, and it was like a testament of democracy in Cameroon.
Right.
Now the Constitutional Council has declared the incumbent the winner, and it has even been inaugurated. But it seems like the runner-up has gone from declaring victory a couple of days after the polls closed, next refusing to accept the results of the verdict given by the declarations given by the Constitutional Council, the highest authority in the land, and now calling for a recount. What do you make of that?
I don't blame him. I would do the same thing.
On what grounds?
On the grounds that there were irregularities, major irregularities, not even minor irregularities. And secondly, the Constitutional Council is a joke. I mean, the Constitutional Council, literally, the Constitutional Council is a joke. The Constitutional Council are all...
It's easy to say it's a joke.
It is a joke.
The deliberations took place in broad daylight.
That was
well coordinated. Everybody had the opportunity. We heard lawyers, we heard people say everything, not only focusing on elections, because that's one thing. Many people questioned, why were they talking about everything else when we're talking about whether or not an election should be cancelled based on the technicalities or the electoral process. So go ahead.
So let me tell you this. That's because Mr. Paul Biya, even though we don't usually like to give him credit, he's a very savvy guy. He's a savvy leader. He's a savvy politician. All what you saw dramatized on, that's the first time that we've seen the Constitutional Council streamed live. Wait, let me finish. But this is not the first time Cameroon has had a national TV.
Well, but this is the first time. This is the first time the Constitutional Council is exercising its powers, because it just came into office recently without an election taking place up until now. So they are well in. But
again, that's what I'm saying, that this was well televised for television, because our president, like I say, we don't give him enough credit for it. He's a very savvy guy. What he was trying to do after all the things that Cameroon has been through leading up to this election was to show the world that, look, you're talking about democracy. Here it is. People want to talk about not being able to express themselves. Well, you watch it on TV. And all of that was televised to, misguide the international community and to misguide people. Do you really think that so the Constitutional Council considered 17 petitions that were brought before it and dismissed all of them as unfounded? Really?
This is the point. We just talked about the electoral process.
Right.
The electoral code is robust. The information there is clear. Observers can come from anywhere. It's acceptable. USA, many other countries practice it. The people who went for the elections, the candidates who went in, 9 were retained. The petitions were supposed to be submitted 72 hours and so on. Some parties got rejected on the grounds of late entry.
Right.
But then all the others who were accepted had enough time to air their minds, explain everything. But one thing was missing: evidence. Evidence. Because, legal luminaries would say that in itself was a good process.
Oh, I don't say that the process, I don't say that what happened was bad. No, what I'm saying is that, and that's where I talk about people being misguided. What I'm saying is that all what you saw was a demonstration of democratic values and principles. The only problem with that is that it was a sham, because the people who sit on the Constitutional Council are appointed by the same president of the Republic, who was a candidate for the elections and who was one of the parties that people were alleging helped create some of the irregularities that led to his win. Again, let me just make a quick point. Again, if we were talking about the validity of those elections, and we're talking about the fact that Cameroon is 24 million people, there was 12 million eligible voters, and only 6 million people registered, and only 3 million voted, and then in 2 regions in the country, there was a virtual abstinence from the vote, and yet we are considering that a valid election? How is that not a sham?
Well, you have to put that in its context. There are many countries that have terrorist groups and many people dividing the country. Yet the institutions try to function. And an election is part of the processes. It's true, what you've raised as those points are the things that pundits and many people and critics use that to say the elections could not have been free, fair, and transparent. Now, the runner-up is calling for a recount. And the president-elect has now been inaugurated. What next?
Well, what next? It's left for the opposition parties, or for those who still think that they've been treated unfairly, to mobilize. That's the thing. When I talk about Cameroon democracy and I use terms as a joke, a sham, it's just a way for me to sort of play down that way. I think Maurice Kamto, who was the runner-up, who declared himself a winner, I think he's called for a national resistance, right? And he's trying to lead a movement of people who are going to stand up to this regime, right? And so one of the things that he's asking is that people mobilize and come and support the resistance. It's akin to what...
But that is contrary to Republican values. There's always another election, and there are many more elections, and
Yeah,
you have to respect the laws of the land, because if he were in office and declared winner, would he allow a runner-up outside to be doing a resistance move?
No, I think when he talks about resistance, he doesn't mean it in the sense as, you know, pick up weapons or guns or sticks or whatever and you know, go into the street.
No, but when you trade within those lines, you're asking yourself,
no, but
what do you want to achieve? Because he used to be a minister in the regime.
right.
He had the same opportunities to see the system from within. And he, being a professor of law, it means that you have to respect the law.
He does.
Even if you can criticize the law.
I think he does. I think we're taking the term resistance literally. I think what he meant was that people have to rise up and to resist the system that is oppressing them. And it could be very well that this resistance is to garner the vote, mobilize people to now work towards redeeming these elections in the next 2 years, which is the legislative elections.
We can talk all day on this topic, and I think we need to have our eyes glued to see what will happen, whether it's resistance for change or it's resistance for something else. Definitely, I don't think you're reading his mind, but these are very important issues, and the people of Cameroon are very concerned. And I think the international community should be,
yes,
because if anything should happen, it's not going to be nice, especially with the ongoing crisis, which we'll talk about on another episode. So again, thanks for watching, and we have a lot to think about, and we are keeping our eyes glued on Cameroon because everybody should pay attention. The international community should pay attention. These are trying moments. And the topic again on Worldview today was about the electoral process in Cameroon, and for all that it is, free, fair, transparent or not. But remember, in any situation, if you're not part of the solution, you shouldn't be part of the problem. I'm your host, Van Keng, and stay tuned for more on Worldview. And until next time, take care.